right. Well, thank you, Presidents Caldwell and Niash. Just a reminder that this session is live recorded and that all attendees are muted during this section of the summit. If you have any questions for us or the keynote speaker, we ask that you use the chat box as we have folks monitoring that. Thank you. And up next, we have our keynote speaker for day one, Dr. Dan Wildcat. Our first keynote speaker is Dr. Dan Wildcat. Daniel R. Wildcat is a Yuchi member of the Muskogee Nation of Oklahoma. His service as a teacher and administrator at Haskell spans 35 years. In 1994, he helped form a partnership with the Hazardous Substance Research Center at Kansas State University to create the Haskell Environmental Research Studies Center as a nonprofit Native American research center to facilitate: one, the technology transfer to tribes, the transfer of accurate environmental information to tribes, and research opportunities for tribal college faculty and students. He is the author and editor of several books, including Power and Place: Indian Education in America with Vine Deloria Jr., Destroying Dogma: Vine Deloria's Legacy on Intellectual America with Steve Pavlik, and his most recent book, Red Alert: Saving the Planet with Indigenous Knowledge, which suggests current environmental issues will require the exercise of indigenous ingenuity, and wisdom. Please welcome Dr. Dan Wildcat.
Sanlay, Gayasada, Agelasan, Selagi, Zoyaha, Yuchiha, Muskogee. Thank you very much, Tom. And I hope everyone is doing well this morning. It's such an honor to be here with you for the third Shifting Seasons. Want to give a special thanks to the Wolf River Singers, to Dennis Kenote, Chris Caldwell, your interim president, longtime friend and colleague, and a young woman I've met over the last several years, and one of our future Indigenous leaders, I believe, Jasmine Niash, your student council, student senate president. It really is an honor to be here, and in keeping with, I think, protocol I like to practice, I'd like to start by giving that land acknowledgement to this very place I'm sitting. I'm in Lawrence, Kansas, where Haskell Indian Nations University exists, and I'm sitting not more than probably a third of a mile from the south bank of the Kansas River as it meanders across the north edge of Lawrence, Kansas. A river named for the first earth keepers of this place, the Kanza people, the Ka Nation. Ironically, due to the depredations of federal Indian policy and government action, now live in Oklahoma. So the people who were the first earth keepers of this place now reside in Oklahoma. That's one of the sad aspects of the world we live in today. But they took good care of this place, and I'm thankful to be sitting here. Thankful for this land. You know, Haskell's not more than 2 miles south of where I am, and it sits really on the edge of the Wakarusa River wetlands. So I'm really sitting between two rivers. I'm thankful for that water. After all, water is life. So I acknowledge the land, I acknowledge the water, I acknowledge the air I'm breathing. Thankful for those gifts. And so with that in mind, what I would like to talk about today is that, you know, as we really do lifting, associated with sharing adaptation and resilience knowledge across Indigenous communities. What I'd like to focus on today is those of you that are in your education journey. Well, we're all in an education journey. My education is continuing every day of my life. We are constantly paying attention, trying to gain knowledge. But today I want to particularly hold up and speak to those young individuals who are starting their formal education journey. I want to acknowledge how important their studies are. And I want to speak to them in a way of you. I want to speak to you in a way that suggests that the people of my generation, as we move into with the responsibilities and that we and the activities that we do into that sort of elder status. I want to talk about how important it is for us to be really mindful of all of those relations that have brought us to the place we are today. So in that light, you know, we in Indigenous traditions, it's widely understood that we respect the land, air, and the water has those important gifts we were given for life. And think about that. It's important whether you think of land, air, and water as a gift as opposed to a resource. In fact, we even go further in many of our traditions. We think of those so-called elements of the natural world, the plants and the animals themselves, as our relatives. So I'm going to focus today on what that means and try to share with you some things that I have been fortunate to learn. I don't know how broad my shoulders are, but I know this. As my good friend James Radlingleaf always says, he says, Dan, you know, standing on the shoulders of giants. Those giants, those elders, those thinkers, those indigenous people who held on to our cultures, our knowledges, our wisdom. Could thank so many people, but those who've already started their journey to the stars, my friend and mentor, Vine Deloria Jr., a friend, Wilma Mankiller, Oscar Coagley, Albert, Billy Frank Jr., Bill Tallbull, Jake Swamp, my aunties, Josephine Bigler, my mother and father, who probably the most important elders in my life, Barbara Irene Andrews and Wildcat and Nathaniel Wildcat. And so glad to have many of the people that have shared wisdom and knowledge with me still here. People like Dr. Henrietta Mann, Orrin Lyons, Suzanne Schoen Harjo. It could go on and on of all of these people who have shared their wisdom and their knowledge with me. And so I'd like to begin by suggesting that it's not just what we do that's important, it's how we do things that are important. And one of the things that I have learned is that the sharing that we do is always done with humility, and that as we share the important knowledge we have, it is so, so important that that is accompanied with caring. The sharing must include that affective dimension of caring. The knowledge, it is, we hope, part of systems of life enhancement. And so I think that today, I'm kind of reminded of one of the, and I've told this story several times, so I know some of you've heard it before, but that's all right. Sometimes it's good to hear stories several times, right? That's what oral traditions are. Well, I've told this in several different contexts, but I was at a EPSCoR NSF meeting with some other colleges that were focusing on climate change. This has been about over 10 years ago, and it was in Alaska. And I had never heard this quote before. By the way, the young lady who came up to me gave me something I'd never heard before. Now, I've subsequently been told it is attributed to Teddy Roosevelt, although that's kind of apocryphal. No one can actually document where he said it or when he said it, but I've been told that this may have been communicated to him after he made a trip to Alaska. It just so happens I was in Alaska when, after doing, the scientists, we were all talking about climate change. We were talking about, giving the graphs and the charts and the numbers, and it was a very technical, series of presentations. And a young woman came up to me afterwards, and this is what she said. She said, "Dr. Wildcat, remember, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care." And that really struck me. That was so, it resonated so true immediately. And I think that's really important for us to carry with the knowledge we have. And that's something that, it's not foreign to our way of doing things, indigenous traditions. I think that caring, that conveyance of the care with which you share something is very important. And the people who've shared with me have always embodied that. And I think that's sort of like point one. I want to tell our young folks, it's good to be passionate about something. It's also good to remain humble as you think about what you're sharing and what you might learn, in the process of sharing. What I found out, and I know that this shifting season's third conference will be no different, I will inevitably come away having received more knowledge, wisdom, inspiration than what I'm able to give. That's the way, that's a good way for things to happen. So I want to begin with that first point to our young people. It is good to be passionate. It is also good to be humble. It is good to show that you care. And I think that's really what, is important for us to understand. It's just not what you do that counts. It's how you do things, how you undertake things. So it was just so fantastic to have that protocol this morning. That's something we always do. We do a protocol. So great to hear that drum in the morning. Okay. The Wolf River Singers, to have Mr. Kenote, share that prayer, to have that welcome from your college president and from your student government president, that leadership. So what I'd like to do today is, we'll consider that kind of point one, okay? I'd like to lay out several other ideas that I'd like you to keep in mind as we talk about this important work of sharing adaptation and resilient knowledge across Indigenous communities. We're mindful of protocol, we're passionate, but we maintain our humility in all the work we do. And that's a good thing, because we know ultimately we'll probably receive more than what we gave in doing this kind of good work. It's hard work. It's very hard work. But I'm gonna start by ultimately with what I think it's about. Okay, let's talk a little bit about that. And I was thinking about how what I wanted to do today, and I kept thinking about Pine Delorius, my good friend and mentor's classic work, God is Red. Of course, the various versions, he's added stuff to the end. But if you look at the first edition and where the book in its first, when it was first published, he's added to it, he's modified it. Where it ended in his discussion really about today what we would call the power of place, the power of life on this planet. And so I'm going to read you a direct quote, because I think it speaks to this moment as we are seeing seasons shift, as the planet, our mother, the earth, is experiencing tremendous change. And so I'm going to quote. Delorius says, "The planet itself calls to the living species for relief. Religion cannot be kept within the bounds of sermons and scriptures. It is a force in and of itself. It calls for the integration of lands and people in harmonious unity. The lands wait for those who can discern their rhythms. The peculiar genius of each continent, each river valley, the rugged mountains, the placid lakes, all call for relief from the constant burden of exploitation. Who will find peace with the lands? The future of humankind lies waiting for those who will come to understand their lives and take up their responsibilities to all living things. Who will listen to the trees, the animals, the birds, the voices of the places of the land? As the long peoples of the respective continents rise and begin to reclaim their ancient heritage, they will discover the meaning of the lands of their ancestors. That is when the invaders of the North American continent will finally discover that for this land, God is red." A powerful statement. This is the way Vine Deloria entered his incredible book on this kind of collision between Western civilization and religion and our own intellectual and spiritual sacred traditions. And I think that Shifting Seasons is all about this. that we are paying attention to the rhythms of the land. We are focusing on how can we integrate, as our ancestors did. In fact, they didn't even have to integrate it. That we could even go further. It calls now for us reintegrating our culture with lands, but we know our ancestors, their cultures were emergent from the lands. They were the gifts of this symbiotic relationship between a people and a place. And so today we're honoring that. We're thinking of that. We're thinking about how can we restore systems of life enhancement on this planet. And so shifting seasons is so part of this work. Let's keep that in mind. He says, the future of humankind is waiting for those who will come to understand their lives and take up their responsibilities to all living things. What do our traditions teach us? Well, our traditions, many of our tribal traditions teach us that our first teachers were the animals, were the plants, were the water, was the sun, was the moon, was the stars, was the land, was the wind. We paid attention and we learned something. We learned how to be competent, responsible, and respectable human beings in the places we called home. That's not romanticism. That's indigenous realism. And we're all a part. We all have this incredible opportunity now, maybe in some ways, some that our parents and grandparents didn't have. We have tribal colleges, tribal universities, and we can start indigenizing our work. We don't need to have a war with or constantly butt heads with science. We can study science. We can utilize science, but the value of it will always be framed within our traditions, a Yuchi tradition, a Zoyaha tradition, a Passamaquoddy worldview, a Menominee worldview. And we ask ourselves, what can we do with this knowledge to live well here, to be respectful, competent human beings here? And now with the climate change that we're facing, we see how crucial it is, how critical it is that we share knowledge amongst ourselves. Now, granted, our knowledges are functions of the places we live, that rich symbiotic relationship. But as we share knowledges across communities, across lands and places, we might not adopt everything wholesale, but we might know how they did something, the principles that guided their activities, that it might generate or spark something we have never looked at or paid attention to in our own communities. And let's remember the way we are defining communities. In our communities is, I know the Menominee have, this is such an important part of their social organization, but many tribes have the same thing, where our clans and our clan totems are what? They come from the animals, from the plants. And what do they tell us? They remind us that we are related to the plants, to the animals. That's indigenous realism. That is a powerful insight there to build upon. In a time when we live in an age that geologists, big picture earth scientists now, are saying we've entered a new geologic age. It's not, the Miocene, it's not the Pleistocene, it's not the Jurassic period, but they call it now, we have entered the age of the Anthropocene. Anthro, humans. Age, the age of humans. Wow. Human conduct, behavior, and technology is fundamentally changing our mother, the earth, the ocean currents, our climates, the ice caps, droughts, all kinds of severe weather events that are occurring now. And unfortunately, at this point, the thing that seems to mark this new age of the Anthropocene is the destruction of many of our other than human relatives on this planet. The attack on the biological diversity of the planet, the degradation, the losing of a rich repository of this life diversity on the planet. I think indigenous voices this century will be the most important voices on the planet if we're going to be able to address the physical climate change that we are seeing right now, that we are witnessing, that your symposium speaks so directly to the shifting of the seasons, the way things are changing, not always for the best, for the life we share this planet with. And sometimes coming at a high cost of the loss of life, the loss of biological diversity. So yes, we need some radical experiments right now of indigenuity, of drawing on those ancient Menominee practices and knowledges, and drawing on the wisdom that resides there and saying, how can we use this knowledge to address the very real problems we are facing today? I'm not talking about this kind of linear view of history. Now, we're not talking about going back and living the way our ancestors did. Sometimes things have changed so radically, we can't do that. Particularly if you were nomadic people. And particularly if you were following that great bison up and down the middle of North America, the center of North America. But each of us has knowledge, whether it's about that unique relationship you have with the forest, with the wild rice, with the fish in your lakes, or on the Northwest coast with the salmon, those coastal estuaries, or all of us across the southern United States, our unique relationship with the corn. We have deep spatial knowledges. And out of those, I think we can formulate some fundamental principles that sort of are widely shared by indigenous people that then allow us, as we share what we are learning about how well in a place, again, might not result in an exact replication of what you're doing where you live, but might inspire and generate people to say, oh, we should think about this, and we might consider this, and our places are changing too. Here's something to talk about, and I know, you've heard this before, but I think it's important for us to keep very much in mind that the sharing of knowledge is particularly important as we see climatic zones shift from west to east and from south to north, because it might be that as you get warmer where you live, you will see new animals, see new plants that will migrate with this climate. And so it might be good to have a relationship with people who live south of you, who could share knowledge about the changes you're seeing. Just as you in Menominee may have relatives to the further north, okay, that are going to see changes you might help them with. There's just an incredible amount of work that we can be doing now in tribal colleges and universities. My suggestion is, and my hope, my prayer is that we will begin to develop our research agendas around these experiments with indigenuity. How do we take the wisdom and knowledge of our ancestors and apply it today to solving very, very practical, very real problems about healthcare, about housing, yes, education. It's right now. It's. I think we've got a moment. We've been seeing as during COVID, the pandemic, and then right several months into the pandemic, watching the murder of George Floyd. We've generated this whole awareness now about, or at least it's a talking point about systemic injustice. We need to be promoting systemic justice. We know that just doesn't extend to our other human relatives, but within our deepest indigenous tradition, that justice is about our relationships to our animal kin, our plant kin. These complex ecological systems that we really often best understand as an extended kinship system. This has such incredible power because we are no longer thinking and living in a world full of resources, but we are living in a world full of relatives, and we honor those relationships, and we think about our responsibilities to those relationships. We have the opportunity now to help each other, our human relatives. We have the opportunity to try to enact our lives as responsible relatives to the land, the air, and the water, and the life supported by those powerful relatives. And I think that what I want to tell the young people, that the work is hard. It's hard work. But I think what I want to suggest to you is you have people like Chris Caldwell, people like Dennis Kenote, those elders, your aunties, your uncles, maybe you're lucky enough to have a grandparents. You still have that wisdom in spite of all the problems, very real everyday problems we often deal with. And I think right now we've got to really work on how we can create this kind of, people talk a lot about citizen science. Well, that's citizen science. I get the idea, but I think in our indigenous traditions, we would better understand it as community science. It's just knowledge that we've gained intergenerationally over from time immemorial of the wisdom that resides in a place. And then how we take that and understand that and continue to create, continue to innovate, continue that practice of indigenuity. Doesn't die. It's, our cultures are living. And we need right now to really think deeply how we can address some of these serious issues. So again, the sharing part of it from an indigenous perspective, I think I'm really excited about the voices of the young people who now are talking about land back. Well, what does land back mean? Well, right now it means a lot of things to a lot of different things to different people. But at its most fundamental level, it's our young people are telling us it's about the land. It's about our relationship to the land. It's about exercising responsibilities, behaving like mature human beings, not just thinking of ourselves. That's the problem with the Anthropocene. It's the age of humans, because humans have only been thinking about themselves, and they look at the balance of nature as just full of resources. We treat nature as if it's an ATM through which we're constantly withdrawing, okay, the wealth from our mother. We're appropriating it. We're exploiting it. We're constantly taking out of this, quote, ATM machine, nature. And then when we make deposits, what are we putting back in? Well, it's not good. It's not good for the earth. It's not good for the air. It's not good for the water. I'm hopeful right now. I'm hopeful when I see what's happening with young indigenous people. And I hear these young voices talking about land back, land back. It's all right. That's, what does that mean? Well, let's talk about it. What does land back really mean? Is it unimaginable that the bison could once again come home to the Great Plains? Is it unimaginable that if things continue the way they are with what we call this kind of rural flight in the Great Plains, particularly those who are involved with cereal grain production, and how costly that is, how really unsustainable it is, Wes Jackson, man, some of you have heard his name. He started a place called the Land Institute. Don't agree with everything Wes Jackson has advocated, but he had some really great insights. You don't have to always agree with everything someone says, but try to find the things that are useful, that can be helpful. And I've always admired something, he said about agribusiness in the Great Plains. He said, what we have with agribusiness in the Great Plains, and he was talking about, cereal grain production, wheat, sorghum. He said, that we take a patient, a dying patient, depending on massive doses of chemotherapy, herbicides, pesticides, nitrogen-based, carbon-based fertilizers applied to the fields, who's also on artificial light support system, the artificial light support system. The pivot irrigation systems, center pivot irrigation systems that are draining the Ogallala Aquifer, the largest underground ocean or sea in North America. Yeah, from South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, panhandles of Oklahoma, Texas, down almost to the Rio Grande. We're exhausting it. What happens when that water is gone? Well, it might be that maybe when those cereal grains can't be grown anymore, is it unimaginable that maybe we need the first grains, those short grass and tall grasses? Those are grains. Those perennial grains of the Great Plains come back, and with them the bison. I don't know. I mean, people go, oh, that's unrealistic. We need to think deeply about the issues that we're facing today. And maybe we need to think, about what our responsibilities are to promote systems of life enhancement in everything we do, not just human comfort and convenience and wealth, but enhancement of these kinship communities, these ecosystems we are a part of. Again, that's not romanticism, that's indigenous realism. I want to hold up the young people. I want you to know that you have scholars, teachers, aunts and uncles, parents and grandparents that have your back. Find your passion, get excited. And as we do the work of sharing, remember, do it through caring, do it with humility. We've got a lot of work that we've got to get done. I started this presentation with a quote by Vine Deloria Jr., and I'm going to end it with two quotes. First, I'm gonna go back to Vine again, because he wrote this book, Custer Died for Your Sins, about half a century ago. And I was just thinking about it over the weekend, what am I going to say today, in this presentation? Well, He's got 2 chapters in Custer Died for Your Sins. Came out 50 years ago. Came out in August of 1969. Became a New York Times bestseller. He's got 2 chapters that are really interesting. One is called A Redefinition of Indian Affairs. And he's got a fantastic chapter on Indians in modern society. And in both of those, he raises 2 issues that I think are just, they're right in front of us now. And it's an opportunity that was never fully taken advantage of. We're talking about sharing the knowledges that we have. I want to read this quote from Vine. And here it is. And this is to you young people. This is what Vine was thinking in 1968 when he wrote this. He says, "It would be fairly easy, however, with a sufficient number of articulate young Indians and with well-organized community support." God, that's what we need. Articulate, bright, young, Indigenous people with well-organized community support to greatly influence the thinking of the nation within a few years. He says, the white man asks only for the opportunity to chase the almighty dollar. But he says, Americans would be greatly moved to hear the articulate intelligence of people who saw the world and understood the world differently. My prayer right now is that we will use this opportunity to hold up our articulate right. And who's going to hold them up? Your communities. And if we do that, Vine thought this was a possibility. We might do what, again, one of our thinkers and an earth keeper, Pulitzer Prize winning author N. Scott Momaday has recently published in this thin little volume of his. It's called Earthkeeper, Reflections on the American Land. By the way, Scott's not paying me anything to use this, okay? So there's no inside deal going on here. But I want to read you something that he wrote. And I think it's a good way to conclude this presentation, this keynote today. And then I'd love to hear your questions, your comments. This is Momaday in his most recent book. A friend and colleague of mine wrote of the machine in the garden. Another wrote of the virgin land. The writing centers on the coming of the industrial age to the pastoral America and the notion of manifest destiny, respectively. Both are important studies of American history. As such, they focus on the past. But it is the present and the possibilities of the future that must concern us. Ours is a damaged world. We humans have done the damage, and we must be held to account. We have suffered a poverty of imagination, a loss of innocence. There was a time when, quote, a man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, end quote, this new world, quote, commensurate to his capacity for wonder, I would strive with all my strength to give that sense of wonder to those who will come after me. I would modify that slightly. I would say it's not time to pause and hold our breath. It's time to pause and take a deep breath and be thankful for the gifts we've been given, and do everything we can within our power and our imagination, with the help of all of the life around us, to become rich again in imagination. Not being satisfied to just survive, not being satisfied to just get along, but let's live in a world where we can thrive. And if we do so, I think Indigenous people, I think if we can't, if we're successful in doing so, I think Indigenous people will play a tremendous role in that activity. And I think you young folks have some hard work ahead of you, but there's a good number of us that have your back. And I don't know if my shoulders are wide enough, but there are many of us that feel like it's time for us to repay that debt, or I guess to apply the credit we were given by being able to stand on the shoulders of giants, to encourage you to do the same. Let's roll up our sleeves and get to work. I am so thankful for having the opportunity to speak today at the third Shifting Seasons. And I look forward to, I think I've left a little time for some questions, I hope so, to discussing things with you. So, Sanle Gadasawa.
Thank you, Dr. Wildcat. That was an awesome keynote. And, now we'll take time for questions from the audience. And then I think we have a few questions as folks start to are chatting down, are typing their questions in the chat.
Yeah. Great.
So I think just a comment, I guess, to start things off was I really appreciated your theme of Indigenous realism versus romanticism. I think that's such a thin line that we tread on as scholars, and always having to explain that to the non-native audience or non-native scholars that we work with, and that the way that you framed it as far as the care principle or the care ethic, and that really is the centering piece when it comes to Indigenous realism versus romanticism. So thank you for that. But I guess just to get things rolling as far as questions, let's see. Here's one. So how do we get the young people or youth interested in climate resilience and just in general about the land and our relatives when technology seems to be getting in the way these days?
Technology is one of our major challenges. And I think the thing we do is we try to get our young people out of doors, literally and figuratively. The more we can get our young people out, get them off the iPads, tell them to take the phone and unplug it and turn it. These things dominate our lives. And we've got to, I'm glad we have this technology. We're using technology today, right? I'm not critiquing the technology. I'm just saying we have to put that technology in its proper place. And it's the Western dominant society thinks of technology as an independent variable. It's not. It's a dependent variable. We need to reframe the value of this in terms of our culture, our community, and is it actually facilitating communication or harming communication? I mean, I think it really is true that you're right. You know, if you talk to a person about their environment today, there would be a lot of young people who probably their environment is this: Facebook, you know, TikTok, whatever, YouTube, all the streaming things they're doing. This is where they're paying attention. We need to reconnect ourselves out of doors and rebuild those kinship relationships. So that would be the activity I think we've got to do.
Awesome. So another question we have is, for those wanting to work with Indigenous communities and also, I guess, Indigenous knowledge that, you know, resides in those communities, what advice would you give them?
Well, you don't want to be accused of being a culture vulture. You don't want to be one of the people who comes in and like, gee, I want to know all about you and tell me all about this and explain all this. I think the thing to do is to build a relationship. And when you visit, the most important communication skill you will need to have is the ability to just listen. Just listen. Just be polite. And you would be surprised what you will learn. And again, it might not be a formal lecture about the wild rice or anything, but if you pay attention to how people communicate, how they conduct themselves, what they do, you begin to get insights. And before you know it, the people that you are around, that you're visiting with, they will let you know if there's trust there, and they will let you know if you're welcome, and they'll do it very, very, very clearly. And so what I would say is, don't, in your enthusiasm, you don't want to come off as pushy, you want to come off as intruding. Just make friends and hang out. And before you know it, they might be asking you, you know, to help with things. They might be sharing knowledge with you. And I think that's a really great skill. You know, that's the part of communication we still don't emphasize enough, how to be an active listener. Yeah. That'd be my advice.
Awesome, great. I think also just a follow-up to the first comment, I guess going back to Indigenous realism and romanticism, finding ways to, I guess, navigate that. Do you have any recommendations as far as, you know, things such as Indigenous thought, linguistics, Indigenous language? You mentioned the values aspect and how important and integral that is when it comes to Indigenous realism.
Yeah. Good question. And this is a tough one. This is a tough one because this is, I think you used the phrase, Tom, something like, you know, it's kind of a thin line we walk, you know, this kind of romanticism versus realism. And I think the way you address that is talk about the fact that our relationship to nature was not a sort of hands-off esoteric aesthetic appreciation only. I mean, we have that. We see the beauty in it, okay? But we saw the beauty while we were cutting down trees. We saw the beauty when we were fishing. We saw the beauty when we were hunting. We saw the beauty when we were working with you. In other words, we were working. We were working, we were laboring. And sometimes it's very hard. Sometimes it's difficult. And to me, that's Indigenous realism. We learn to appreciate what we had in the act of living. And that's one of the biggest challenges we have. That's why, we should really think deeply about how we can, in practical ways, be connected in a real hands-on way with our food again. Be connected in a real hands-on way with our trees, with our lakes, with our rivers, with the earth. And that's not romantic. Some people might get a little bit upset when you say, well, we're going to go out and we're going to get our hands dirty today, and it's going to be hard work. No, that's the Indigenous realism I'm talking about, because it's in that work that you begin to know those relatives.
Awesome. Well, I think that, yeah, that's pretty much what we have for questions. So we'd like to just say Match Willan to you, Dr. Wildcat, for that great keynote. We really appreciated it. Thanks so much.
Well, Sunlay, yeah, thank you so much.
So real quickly, I guess I would just like to say thank you to the Wolf River Singers, to Mr. Kenote, our Menominee elder and veteran, President Caldwell, and Student Body President Jasmine Niash, and then of course, again, to Dr. Wildcat, our keynote speaker. And so right now we're going to take about a 38-minute break, and we'll return at about 12 p.m. Central Time, and people will go to their various breakout sessions, which can be found on the agenda on Pathable. So then just really quickly, make sure you feed yourself, you drink something, grab some more coffee and water, take a bio break, look away from the screen. Eye stress, Zoom fatigue is very real, as Dr. Wildcat has his coffee. But also make sure you check out the virtual tours we have on the event page. So whenever you have time to do that as well. So again, we'll just take a break until about 12 p.m. Central, so in about 37 minutes, and we'll see you all in your breakout sessions.